Hey YouTube, I'm Ross Stewart with Stewart Media Digital, and today I'm talking about the Sony G200-600mm f5.6 to 6.3 zoom lens for the Sony mirrorless system. Now, I rented this lens from aperturant.com. Make sure to check them out in the link below. For a trip to Iceland that I just got back from. So if I look pretty tired, I've been traveling nonstop for the last 10 days, but I'm back now and would love to talk about this lens. Now, I rented this lens specifically to take pictures of the puffins in Iceland, but every time I went out to where they are, it was super dark and foggy and mist everywhere. Thankfully, this lens is weather sealed, and I'll talk about that more in the build quality section. So I got a couple pictures, but it wasn't really what I was looking for. But I still got a ton of great bird photos, and this is actually the second time I have rented this lens. I also took it through the American Southwest and got some cool wildlife photos. Now, in my opinion, this is primarily a wildlife and bird lens. I think it can also be used for some outdoor sports, but with that 5.6 to 6.3 aperture, and realistically, most people are going to be shooting this lens at 600 millimeters, at which the maximum aperture is 6.3. I really don't think that this has a ton of indoor applications unless you just have really amazing light. But anyway, here's some photos I took with this lens. Let's get into it. One of the reasons that this lens is super exciting to me is because it is only $2,000. Now, that is not a cheap lens, but for a lens in this focal range going all the way into 600 millimeters, that is much cheaper than a lot of the alternatives. All right, so first up, let's talk about the build quality. The build quality of this lens is really nice. It feels solid in the hand, but it is pretty heavy at 4 pounds, 11 ounces. And it does feel extremely front heavy, but from a large zoom lens like this, you really can't expect anything else. The zoom ring has a pretty short throw going from 200 to 600, and I really think that's because they expect people to find their target at 200 millimeters and then quickly zoom in to 600 millimeters. I spent most of my time shooting at 600 millimeters. I mean, that's really why you buy a lens like this, but it is really hard to pinpoint a bird at 600 millimeters. So being able to zoom out to that 200 to center it and then zoom in quickly is pretty nice. So even though it is a short throw from 200 to 600 millimeters, I think that that was actually a very deliberate and smart design choice. Now, on the other hand, the manual focus ring feels really loose to me. I don't know if it's just this copy I have, but in some situations where a bird was surrounded by branches and it had trouble autofocusing, I threw it into manual focus and tried to pinpoint that bird perfectly, and the manual focus just felt loose and slippery. I had a hard time using this manual focus ring. And of course, like pretty much every Sony lens I've ever reviewed, except for maybe one or two, it is focus by wire, which, as you probably know by now, is not my preference. Now, in terms of other buttons and switches, this lens has more than most of Sony's lenses. It has a autofocus manual focus switch, and then it has a range limiter for the autofocus. So you can use the full range, or if you know your subject is further away, you can do 10 meters to infinity, or if it is a little bit closer, you can do 2.4 meters to 10 meters. And that will keep it from hunting all the way forward, all the way back as you're trying to lock that autofocus. Now, this lens does have image stabilization, or what Sony calls optical steady shot. And it does have a switch to turn that off. There are some rare applications for turning it off, like if you do want to get, if you're panning or you're following a bird really quickly. But an alternative option to that is it also has 3 image stabilization modes. There's 1, 2, and 3, and the different modes limit the axes on which the image stabilization works. So let's say if you were panning and you didn't want it to try to stabilize your movement left to right, you could switch it over to one of the other modes and limit that panning stabilization. So that is pretty cool to see in a lens like this. This lens also has 3 autofocus lock buttons, which can be customized to do pretty much anything. And thankfully, Sony knew that this lens was going to be used outdoors primarily, so it is fairly weather sealed. It has a fluorine coating on the front element, a nice rubber gasket in the back, and all the joints and buttons are weather sealed, which is pretty nice because I did use this in some light mist and the lens was totally fine. This lens does come with a fairly large bayonet style lens hood, which does add quite a bit of size to the overall lens. I mean, this thing is massive. You will get pretty tired carrying it around all day, but you can always use something like a monopod or a tripod for some extra stabilization, but just be prepared, this is a massive lens. And finally on the build, it does have a 95mm filter thread, which is pretty big, and you are going, if you do want to use ND filters, circular polarizers, UV filters, any of that kind of stuff, you will probably be shelling out a decent amount of money for some of those big, massive filters. Overall, this lens is pretty nicely built, and I really have no major complaints about the build quality. Moving on to image quality. This lens has 24 elements in 17 groups, including 1 spherical element and 5 extra low dispersion elements. And it is a really nice and sharp lens. It is not the sharpest lens out there, but for a lot of what most people are going to be using it for, like I'm a hobbyist, for example, when it comes to birds. I don't shoot birds professionally or any kind of wildlife. I also don't shoot outdoor sports professionally. So I don't necessarily always need the best of the best when it comes to image quality. So this lens does really amazing. And I don't mean to say that this has bad image quality. It is really sharp. You can crop in a good amount and still have a very decent, very usable image. And again, Sony knew we would be using this lens primarily outdoors, and it does have the nano anti-reflective coating, so it does handle ghosting and flaring really well, shooting into those bright highlights or directly into the sun. It's not perfect, it never is, but it handles it pretty well anyway. Moving on to bokeh, this lens has an 11 bladed aperture and the blades are circular, so you get really nice and smooth bokeh, which is really great. Even at 6.3, the depth of field when you're at 600mm is shockingly thin. So it is really nice that this lens handles those backgrounds or those out of focus areas, whether it's the background or the foreground, so well. That shallow depth of field really helps draw the eye directly to your subject, whether it's a bird, other wildlife, or a person playing outdoor sports. You get really nice depth of field with this lens, which a lot of people might not think is possible with a 6.3, but again, at that 600mm focal length, you still get a really nice shallow depth of field, and this lens makes it look beautiful. Now let's talk about the autofocus. That is one of the most important elements when you're talking about a sports or wildlife lens. Now this lens has a DDSSM autofocus system, which stands for, sorry, I'm gonna have to read this, Direct Drive Supersonic Wave Motor for super fast and accurate autofocus. Sorry, in this test footage that I'm showing you of the autofocus, it's not necessarily the best to show it off, but when I was shooting those birds, I was very focused on shooting at the birds, and when I got home to do this review, all I had was my dogs. So, but take my word for it, the autofocus works really well. It is snappy. Shooting birds against the blue sky or shooting birds in trees, the lens found them very quickly and stayed on them even as they moved throughout the frame. All right, and as usual, let's finish off by talking about some of this lens's competitors. Now, there's really not a ton of direct competitors to this lens. The ones I'm gonna be talking about are almost kind of ridiculous to compare this lens to. First, let's talk about the 600mm prime lens. That is a G Master and it is an f4 maximum aperture lens, but it's also $13,000 US. So it is not even in the same league as this lens. That lens is really for people who absolutely need the best sharpness. That f4 aperture is gonna give you a stop and a third better low light. The autofocus is super snappy, but it is also almost twice as heavy at 6.7 pounds. So it is a lot heavier and that thing is massive. But it is super sharp and it is a great lens for the professionals who need the absolute best of the best. But again, you're probably not thinking, should I get the $2,000 lens or the $13,000 lens? If you've got the budget for the $13,000 lens, that one's obviously going to be the best. But for the rest of us who can't afford something like that, this $2,000 G lens is a great alternative. And a slightly less ridiculous comparison, let's also just talk about the Sony 100-400mm G Master lens. That is also a variable aperture lens, but it is a slightly lower range with 4.5 at the 100mm focal length and 5.6 at the 400mm focal length. Now that lens is only about $500 more expensive at $2,500. That is a G Master lens though, so the build quality, the sharpness, they are all going to be just a little bit better. But you only go to 400mm on that one. And in my opinion, animals don't tend to like to get close to us, so that extra reach, being able to go out to 600mm or 900mm in aps-c mode is really, really useful. So in my personal opinion, this 200-600, if you are interested in wildlife photography, in outdoor sports, even if you've just got a kid in soccer, this 200-600 is really gonna be a great option for you. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I have one more lens that I took to Iceland, the 12-24mm. I will be doing a review on that coming up very shortly. So please be sure to like and subscribe to check that out. Thank you guys so much.